Well, good morning, everyone. We continue our series today titled Being Overcomers. And as we've worked our way through for the last 4 or 5 weeks, I'm expecting that perhaps some of you have maybe felt yourselves a little bit immune to some of the issues that we've touched on. Perhaps you don't feel particularly insecure. Perhaps self-importance is something that you don't really identify as being problematic in your life. Maybe you are quite convinced that you are the least judgmental person that you know. And maybe you've never been bored an entire moment in your lifetime. And if that's been maybe how you've felt up until now, I'm going to be so bold as to suggest that maybe overcoming poor self-awareness is something that you might like to investigate in your own time. But if you are absolutely sure that none of the last 4 or 5 weeks have applied to you, then I think today is your day. Because I don't think I know anyone who at some point in their life has not met with disappointment in one form or another. Disappointments are the stuff of life. Bad things do happen. And yes, they do seem to happen to believers just as frequently as they seem to happen to non-believers, because we all live in a fallen world and disappointments don't discriminate. There are many forms that disappointment can take in our lives. I'm going to go through a little list of them, and I'm sure as we go through, you will find some that apply to your life, or you will know others for whom these particular disappointments are applicable. A child can lose a parent very early on in life and have to go through life without knowing the guiding influence of that person in their lives, sometimes even struggling to remember anything at all about that person. A parent loses a child. Now, whether that be at a very young age, a baby, or an adult child, no one expects their child to die before they do. A young man or woman looks forward to finding a partner in life and settling down. Instead, he or she will remain single for life. A young couple eagerly anticipates starting a family of their own, but infertility takes that dream from them. Parents, unaware that they are carriers of a genetic disease, give birth to a child who will suffer terribly for life. An accident leaves an otherwise perfectly healthy individual permanently disabled. You lose your job. You repeat mistakes of the past that you were determined not to repeat. Poor mental health makes it difficult for you to cope with just day-to-day activities of life. A failed business venture leaves your family struggling financially. An investment goes bad and life savings are lost. A builder goes broke and home buyers lose the lot. Fire, flood, or some other natural disaster destroy homes and livelihoods. The ATAR score that you needed is not the one that you got. A marriage fails, a child makes poor choices in life, addiction takes hold in your life or the life of someone that you love. You receive a distressing diagnosis. You fall victim to a scam. You witness a traumatic incident that leaves you scarred for life. You're the victim of crime. You lose a child or children to miscarriage. Illness takes from you the best years of your life. Your spouse dies. Someone you love develops a degenerative disease. A stock market crash drastically reduces your retirement income. You are unable to remain in your home and find yourself in aged care. The career that you worked so hard to achieve turns out not really to be what you expected it to be. The project that you poured your energy into for so long gets shelved. Friends or colleagues betray you. Your family just don't seem to understand you. You're overlooked for a promotion. You miss a great opportunity. The circumstances of life take you far away from family and friends. You are lonely. The demands that work place upon you leave you permanently exhausted, with little time for anything else. Your prayers don't seem to be answered, at least not in the way that you had hoped they would be. And life just seems so much harder than you thought it ever would be. So often the reality of life just doesn't seem to align with what we might have hoped. It's a bit like when the penguins in that 2014 animated movie, I don't know how many of you would have seen it, Penguins of Madagascar. Anyone who's got children has probably seen it, young children. Having escaped the zoo and finally realised their dream of reaching Antarctica, step out onto the ice for the first time. And there's a scene that lasts for about 2 minutes in that movie where the four of them are standing there, and all you can hear is the whistling, howling sound of a blizzard blowing around them. They're getting whipped by the snow and ice that's hitting them. They are soaking wet. They can't see more than about a metre in front of them. They are freezing cold, and after about 2 minutes of this, the smallest penguin turns to the others and expresses what they're all thinking. Does anyone know what he says? He says, "Well, this sucks." Sometimes life just doesn't live up to our expectations. And all of us, from time to time, will experience disappointment. And when it comes to great disappointments in the Bible, you really can't go past the experience of the exile. Most of you will remember the story. God has redeemed his people out of slavery in Egypt, and he's brought them into the promised land. And there he has provided for them, there he has dwelt among them in that great temple that Solomon built. They were his chosen people, and he was their God. And yet, time and time again, they would be unfaithful to him. They would fail to keep his commands. They would run after pagan gods. They would not listen to the prophets who were sent to them. They would not honour God. And so he allowed the full force of the army of Babylon to come against them. And God's people find themselves in exile in Babylon. They find themselves in a foreign land, separated from land, separated from the temple, separated from everything that was familiar. And what they experienced there was a crisis of theology, as much as it was a crisis of identity, as much as it was simply a physical crisis. Everything that was once certain was now uncertain. Who were they now? Where was God? How could this have happened to God's people? And what was life going to look like now without the temple as the centre of religious and social life for them? Well, God speaks to the exiles through the prophet Jeremiah, and he doesn't promise to miraculously end all of their suffering. Instead, he tells them to build houses where they are, settle down where they are, plant and eat what they can produce, marry and have sons and daughters, and increase in number where they are. He tells them to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city where they are in exile. And he warns them not to listen to false prophets and diviners who are out to deceive them. And then he promises that at the end of 70 years, he will gather them out of the nations where he has sent them, and he will bring them back to their own land. And that is where we pick up this story today. God's people have lived through all of that massive disappointment. They've survived the 70 years in exile, and just as he promised, God gathers them back to their own land. And he uses King Cyrus of Persia as an agent who will issue a decree that will allow those people to return, and they return laden with gifts, gold and silver from their neighbours and livestock and all sorts of things, as well as all of the items that were taken from the temple originally. They're able to bring them back with view of returning them when the temple is rebuilt. And so we pick up this story here in Ezra chapter 3. The exiles return and they settle in their towns, and then we're told when the 7th month came, they assembled in Jerusalem as one man. So with a common or a united purpose, they come and assemble in Jerusalem. Now, most of us would skip over that little detail in the 7th month when we were reading. But no Jew would skip over that, because it tells you something very important. The 7th month was a very, and still is, a very important month on the Hebrew calendar. So the first month is Nisan here. But that is not when New Year happens. New Year is celebrated here in the 7th month. And you can see how rich that 7th month is with all of the festivals and feasts. So that month begins with Rosh Hashanah, which marks the Jewish New Year. 10 days after that comes Yom Kippur, the all-important Day of Atonement. Then comes Sukkot, the festival of booths or tabernacles, when they would remember God's goodness to them as they came out from Egypt and as they journeyed through the wilderness and spent time sheltering in booths or tabernacles. Then after that comes Simchat Torah, which marked the completion of the 1-year cycle of the reading of the Torah and the beginning of yet another cycle. So this was a month that was special to the people because it was a particularly pious time. It was filled with a lot of festivals, a lot of remembering their past, and it is rich in the lives of the Hebrew people. And it is in that 7th month that Zerubbabel and his associates, the priest Yeshua and his fellow priests, begin the work. And they choose to begin with the altar. Now, Scripture highlights that they were very careful to put the altar exactly in the place that God had previously revealed that it should go. Their years in exile had been a time of much soul searching, and they returned with a renewed zeal for the Torah, for God's law, and a determination that they would keep his commands. And so they were careful to build it on its foundation, and that was probably no easy task given the size of some of the rubble that was all about them from the destroyed temple. And some of that rubble is evident even today, as you can see there. And they did all of this despite their fear of the peoples around them. And then they began making the required sacrifices and celebrating these festivals again. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival, having assigned the workers and organised the supplies of materials for the work of building, they actually get going and the work of building begins. And in verse 10, the foundation for the temple is laid, and then the entire community breaks and they gather to praise the Lord. the priests with their trumpets, the Levites with their cymbals, and they sing this familiar refrain that is found in the Psalms. He is good, his love to Israel endures forever. He is good. And the word used there for good is hesed. It's God's goodness expressed through his covenant. He is good and his love endures forever. Now the people are enthusiastic in their praise. There is excitement in the air. There's shouting and there's a sense of anticipation. But in the midst of it all, a sound of weeping can be heard. And it's not a good or happy weeping. And it's coming from the older folks. It's coming from the ones who were old enough to remember the former temple and all of its glory. And now, having seen this new foundation of this new temple laid, they knew that it could never live up to what they once had. The shouting is loud, the weeping is loud, and the whole cacophony is so loud that no one could distinguish the shouting from the weeping, and it could be heard far away. If only they could have seen that the former temple as God had seen it. Outwardly spectacular and beautiful. But inwardly it was full of sin and idolatry of the people. And that was what had driven God's presence from it in the first place. This is a very, very human scene. I think we can all identify with it. The great joy of the young ones who had never seen the former temple. They'd just grown up with all the stories about it. And they lived with that dream of going back. And now here they were, and they were part of the work, and it is exciting. And the great disappointment and the mixed emotion of the elderly who knew what they had once had and what they had lost, and who wept with disappointment for what might have been. Now, it isn't the end of the story, of course. It would take them many years and plenty of encouragement from the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to get this work of building done in the face of all of the opposition around them. But for today, I just want to stick in chapter 3 of Ezra and try and pull out a few key takeaways that might help us in handling and overcoming disappointment. The first thing that the returning exiles did after they had settled was to rebuild the altar. The altar was the place where they could meet with God and offer sacrifices. So the altar was vital for right relationship with God. Their years in exile had taught them the dangers of trying to live without God as the centre of their being. Exile was the result of the mess that they had got themselves into, trying to go it alone. And out of that massive disappointment came this renewed resolve never to let that happen again. And so in the midst of the rubble of their disobedience, they begin to rebuild the altar, because it was there at the altar that relationship could be restored. Now these days, most churches, of course, don't have altars anymore, and certainly no one is offering animal sacrifices on any of them, because, of course, Jesus, having offered himself as the perfect sacrifice for sin, has done away with the need for that system of relating to God. So when I say they rebuilt the altar here, and when I say that we should rebuild the altar, what I'm referring to is not a physical altar, of course, but that resolve to put God first. To rebuild the altar is to recognise that I cannot do this on my own. I cannot restore my business. I cannot start again. I cannot fix my marriage. I cannot go through this grief. I cannot overcome this addiction. I cannot. carry whatever the burden is that is upon you. I need Jesus. I need Jesus who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Many of us get ourselves so busy trying to fix our own mess of the circumstances of life around us, that we have little time left for God. Or we get ourselves so angry about the circumstances of life that have hit us that we turn our backs on the altar altogether. Zerubbabel and the others with him were basically in charge of a rebuilding program on a national scale. They were busy and they were surrounded by problems on every side, and yet they prioritised that right relationship with God. To rebuild the altar is to reassess one's priorities and to make sure that we attend to first things first, that we tend first to the soul, build the altar or revisit it and get right with God. That's our first lesson from these returning exiles. The next major piece of work for these returnees was to put down a solid foundation on which they could build the temple. Now, living before Christ as they did, the temple was central to religious and social life, hence their great desire to rebuild it, beginning, of course, with the laying of the foundation. Now, every builder knows that foundations come first and that it's important to get the foundations right. If you get the foundations right, you have a good solid base on which to build. If you mess up the foundations, then you can expect all sorts of problems in the build. For believers, Jesus is the foundation upon which we must build our lives. Any attempts to build aside from him will be futile. If you've got financial problems, definitely go and get financial advice. If you've got relationship issues, see a marriage counsellor, please do. If you've got psychological problems, see a psychologist. If you've got health problems, of course, go and see the doctor. But do all of these things with Jesus as that foundation upon which you seek to build. Well, in spite of the enormity of the task and in spite of all of the rubble around them, in spite of their fear and in spite of the opposition that would come, God's people began the process of rebuilding the temple. But it wasn't long before they were tempted to despair, because all that they had achieved seemed to them so insignificant. So God sent them the prophet Zechariah, who asked, "Who despises this day of small things?" And then said to them, "Men will rejoice when they see the plumb line in the hands of Zerubbabel." Now they would rejoice because a plumb line is something that measures how vertical something is. So if you've got a plumb line in your hand, you have to have something vertical to measure. So there's going to be walls. So he's saying that the work will get done, and it will get done in Zerubbabel's lifetime because he's the one who's got the plumb line in his hand. We must not despise our own day of small things, because God is in the small things. Instead, we need to yield our disappointments to God and resolve to walk forward with him one step at a time, without worrying how small that step might be, as long as we are moving forward with God. Now, while all of this was going on, the community took time to remember and to celebrate. They celebrated that feast of booths or tabernacles, as we've mentioned, remembering all of their past and all the good things that God had done for them. They made all the appropriate sacrifices, and then they paused the work of building once the foundation had been laid. They didn't wait for the work to be completed, because if they had, that would have been many years down the track. Instead, they recognised that God was at work among them, and they paused to remember and to celebrate. In the midst of disappointment, when God can seem very far away, we all do well to pause deliberately, to remember what He has done for us in the past, to count our blessings, and to celebrate small beginnings with Him. We also learn from these returnees that we should not be afraid of tears. Jesus certainly wasn't. Tears and sadness and disappointment and grief are all a very normal part of being a human being, and they're a very normal part of the way that God made us to be. Ecclesiastes 3:4-5 says there is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Now, granted, when your young people are busy, excited and celebrating the work that's happening on the new temple, maybe that's not the best time to weep, but there is a time to weep, and we should feel no issue about doing that when hard times come upon us. When our tears become a problem, or our sadness or our disappointment becomes a problem, is when we allow them to paralyse us, when they stop us from being able to take those small steps forward with God. When the opposition to the rebuilding came, and it did come, the people became despondent. They became paralysed. The work was too hard. They stopped moving forward and they began to give up. They focused their efforts instead on building their own homes and livelihoods, and they convinced themselves that it just wasn't time yet to rebuild the temple, in spite of the fact that God had clearly commanded them to the contrary. What they failed to realise was that the work would be done not in their own strength, but by the Spirit of God. And that in succumbing to their own self-pity, they were actually robbing God of the opportunity to demonstrate His power and His glory in and through them. And we make that same mistake over and over again. Zechariah helped the people realise this, and Haggai rebuked them for living in comfortable panelled houses while God's house remained in ruin. And it would take the combined efforts of both of these prophets to get the work of rebuilding back on track. Is there a problem or part of your life that you have placed in the too hard basket, just because it seems too difficult for you to navigate? Can I tell you something that you probably don't want to hear? It is probably too hard for you. But let me tell you something else that you do need to hear. It is not too hard for God. And while we keep working away, trying to panel our own homes, so to speak, we continue to rob God of that opportunity to demonstrate His power and His glory in our own lives. So we need to recognise God's presence in the hard places and rely on Him to get us through. I'm going to leave it there because time is getting away. We're going to close in a minute singing a hymn which I have chosen because I think it speaks into this issue of great disappointment. Life is unpredictable and it is full of disappointments, and there is none that I can think better who knew that more so than the hymn writer Horatio Spafford. His story is very well known. He was a successful attorney and a real estate investor. He lost a great fortune in the Chicago fire of 1871. Around that same time, his 4-year-old son died of scarlet fever. And so Horatio felt that his family really needed a break from all of this suffering. And so he sent his wife and 4 daughters on ahead of him to England to have that break, while he intended to follow them as soon as possible once he had got some business regarding rezoning issues after the fire out of the way. On the way, as they were crossing the Atlantic, there was a collision and the ship went down. And Horatio received a message from his wife which said simply, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" And so as quickly as possible, he got on another boat to go and join her. And the captain of that boat, aware of the circumstances of Horatio's life, called him when they got to the point around about which the previous boat had sunk. And he let him know that it was here that his 4 daughters went down to their deaths. And as he thought about his daughters, these words of comfort and hope filled his heart and filled his mind. Here was a man who worshipped at the altar, who had tended his soul. And he penned the words of this much-loved hymn, "It is well with my soul." Circumstances of life can change at any time. Disappointments are to be expected, but they are not to define us. All may be far from well in your life, but rebuild the altar anyway. Tend the soul. Lay down that solid foundation on Christ and begin to move forward one step at a time, trusting for his help as you do. Remember and celebrate his goodness. Weep and mourn if you need to, but recognise his presence and rely on him even in your disappointments. And then even in the worst of life circumstances, you too will be able to declare, "It is well with my soul."